I'm Joanne Law, Director of Studies for Mediation Institute and co-founder of Interact Support. I'm on a mission to prevent violence by training and supporting dispute resolution practitioners. Mediation Musings is a series of conversations with mediators and for mediators. So if you're interested in dispute resolution, follow the channel. We're intending to update new recordings each week. Enjoy. Hello and welcome. I'm Joanne Law, Director of Studies for Mediation Institute and the host of the Mediation Musings podcast. I'm here with Peter Johnstone, who's currently the ADR, Alternative Dispute Resolution Manager at the Queensland Civil and Administrative Tribunal. So thank you, Peter, for agreeing to be on our very first podcast for Mediation Institute. Peter, I know that you've been a mediator for over 25 years, so I certainly want to get your perspective on the mediation industry over that time. But firstly, I'd like to find out a little bit more about the work you do with the Tribunal. Before we go into that, can you tell me a little bit more about the sorts of people you and your team at QCAT deal with and provide mediation services for?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Joanne. As you've said, I'm the ADR manager at QCAT, or the Queensland Civil and Administrative Tribunal at the moment. And that job, I oversee a team of mediators, and across Queensland, I think we have around 30 mediators that I oversee. And you know, we have a real cross section across the community. So there aren't too many groups or individuals that don't, avail themselves of the assistance of QCAT at some point. So we're dealing with all sorts of clients from all sorts of, socioeconomic backgrounds on a daily basis. Probably the biggest amount of work that we do at the moment is in the what we call the minor civil dispute area, or MCD mediations. They are predominantly consumer trader type disputes, and usually over either work done or money owed. And as you can imagine, there's all sorts of people that find themselves in that circumstance. Mm-hmm. In those types of disputes, usually a limited relationship between the parties, not a long-standing relationship, and more often than not, parties are seeking a financial sort of outcome. So they make up probably the lion's share of our work. I'm also involved in some other areas of mediation for QCAT as well. We do work in retail shop lease mediation. So that's a little bit like tenancy disputes, but for commercial properties. So if you if you're a business owner and you rent a commercial property in just a strip mall or in a big shopping centre, there's legislation that covers you as far as that's concerned. Most often that's more detailed contractual sort of work disputes, often legally reasonably complex. And whereas those MCD mediations might go for an hour, retail shop leases can often easily go for 2, 3, 4 hours, depending on the nature of the dispute. The other interesting one that I get involved in from time to time is what we call retirement village disputes. And again, they're all different. Yeah. And they are often between tenants of retirement villages. So, the elderly, most often, and management of those facilities. And they can get into all sorts of disagreements and disputes about the terms of that tenancy. Sometimes it can be multiple parties. So we can be approached by not just one resident, but we can be, contacted by a large number of residents who have
they've all been talking
similar disputes. Exactly, it's got round the rumour mill, and they have similar issues with management, and are looking for a way to sort that out. Right. So that's most of my work.
I'm just really interested in that. So do multiple people come into the mediation, like multiple owners, or does someone become the representative for them? How does that work?
Yeah, and that's something we have to work and negotiate with the parties prior to the mediation. often it can be very difficult to have, a hall full, a room full of people wanting to express their views. So sometimes it's about negotiating with that group of people a more efficient way of dealing with it, and that might be having a smaller group of spokespeople who represent the views of the larger group. So, and again, you also need to take into account the views of the management and what they're comfortable with. They might not want to meet with a marauding horde of angry residents, so you need to take into account the needs of both the residents and what they need to express, but also the management and what's going to be reasonable and comfortable for them as well.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So, no, excellent. So, look, I'm really interested in finding more about you and your, your career and history with mediation. But before we do that, maybe if you could just give the listeners a bit of an idea of the journey that people go through to end up in QCAT mediations or civil and administrative. And there's a civil and administrative mediation service in every state around the country.
Yes, absolutely. There's more or less an equivalent of QCAT in just about all the states and territories now. I think the only one that may still be sort of we get to be underway is in Tasmania, but all the other states and territories, I believe, do have an equivalent. And the journey to get to mediation, and I think you'll find this is the case in just about all the states and territories, is that they're very ADR proactive. So certainly in the QCAT legislation, it states very clearly up front that there's an obligation upon QCAT to give parties the opportunity to resolve things using processes that are quick, that are simple, that are user friendly, and it talks more specifically about alternate dispute resolution as a way of doing that. So most of these tribunals have been set up with a view to dealing with things efficiently, quickly, but also in a very user-friendly manner. So QCAT and all the other tribunals around the country are very proactive in regards to using these services. I'd go one step further than that, and we would actively encourage people to try and resolve things before they even come to QCAT. One thing that we've noticed is that once parties make an application to a court or tribunal, it tends to embed their thinking and their position. And so if we can divert them and get them to, consider some other means of negotiating a solution before they even put that application in, that's going to save everyone time and money. So, we would certainly, the first port of call would be for people who approach us. We would say, have you tried to resolve this yourself? And having said that, if they wish to put their application in, they do so. And different disputes get to mediation in slightly different ways. But I mentioned the minor civil disputes. We probably do between 2,000 and 3,000 mediations a year. Yeah. So just about everything that comes through the door, there are some exceptions, but just about everything that comes through the door goes to mediation. So it's almost like parties can opt out, but it's almost a compulsory process. So getting upwards of sort of 3,000 mediations a year. So I guess that reinforces, as I said before, the importance of ADR to QCAT and that view that it's very frequently a useful option to explore.
Okay, no, that's great. And so are people usually kind of legally represented in this, or it just again depends on whether it's those contractual ones or something?
Yeah, no, QCAT again, and it goes back to that sort of user-friendly, approach that I was talking of before. Parties are usually not legally represented, so it's the exception rather than the rule in regards to legal representation. So parties are certainly entitled to make an application to the tribunal for leave to be represented. and the tribunal will make a determination as to whether they feel as though that's warranted. So sometimes that will be because the issues are sufficiently legally complex, that the tribunal believes that lawyers' involvement is warranted. Sometimes it might be back to the parties. The parties' personal circumstances might mean that the tribunal is convinced that having legal representation is warranted. So, but I would certainly say it's the exception, not the rule. I'd also say, when parties come to us, if they do, if you're in a dispute and you make an application, the other party is consulted beforehand, and we seek a submission from the other person beforehand as well as to whether they agree that legal representation is reasonable. And so both the application and the submission from the other party is taken into account before the tribunal makes a decision.
Right. Okay. No, that's excellent. But look, what I wanted to shift tack now. The other thing that you do apart from working with the tribunal is that you do some work with Mediation Institute as a coach and mentor and assessor for our national accreditation course.
Yep.
We get very good feedback from students about how knowledgeable you are about mediation, and you just blow them away when you jump in and do a little bit of a demonstration for them. So would you mind sharing with the listeners how you started in mediation?
So I started my mediation career back in 1992, and I was a fresh-faced and very naive, I think 21-year-old at the time. And people sometimes ask me the question, how did you get into mediation? Was it good luck or good management? And it was very much good luck. At the time, I was a public servant and studying part-time, and a friend of mine who was a lawyer, and you must understand that at this time, there was very little known about mediation, very little, particularly in Queensland. And the Department of Justice at the time set up what they called the Community Justice Program, which was meant to be like a neighbourhood community mediation service, and they were looking to train mediators.
Yeah.
Anyway, a very wise and learned friend of mine who was a lawyer said, Peter, look, I think there might be something in this mediation business. Why don't you give it a go? And I took his advice and attended the training, and the rest, they say, is history. So at the time, I had very little knowledge of what mediation was about. And all the old jokes about meditation and medication and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, we still get those. Yeah. But luckily, I had a flair for it, and I sort of recognised that, and I guess the people who trained me recognised that. I think one of the real benefits that I had at the time was that I was so young, and I hadn't learnt any bad habits, and I was on the training with people who might have been 30 or 40 or 50 years old. They were experienced lawyers and psychologists and social workers and what have you. And, I was a clean slate, basically. And whereas a lot of those people were very experienced practitioners and advisors and whatnot, you could see them really struggling, having to take, their hats off. Whereas to me, it was just all new and fresh, and I didn't have to go through that process. So I took to it sort of like a duck to water, and have been doing it ever since.
There's so much that I want to find out a little bit more there. One of the things you mentioned was that you felt and the trainers felt that you had a flair for it. What do you think is that flair for mediation?
Yeah, look, I think that there was some element of, as I said, not having to relearn things or take hats off. And some people really did struggle greatly with that idea of, I'm not an advisor, I'm not here to tell people what to do, I'm not here to counsel people, etc.
Yeah, I do know that, because most of the students at Mediation Institute are mature aged, and there can be a fair bit involved in learning. So you think maybe being able to step into that neutral role without
any history or
baggage or what have you.
yeah. Having said that, I mean, I think also I took into the process, as we all do. There were some things about mediation that I was naturally kind of good at. I think I had a pretty good natural instinct around tracking the dispute and analysing the dispute, and being able to summarise very effectively what people were saying. So again, for whatever reason, I have a knack of being able to listen to half an hour's conversation and sort of wrapping it up into a nice little package and that people can understand easily. So that's something I've been able to always do very effectively. Having said that, again, as any mediator, there's things that I from the start didn't do very well also, and things that I've had to work on over time. So as a 20 or 21 year old, I wasn't very good at recognizing or managing emotions. As you can imagine, for a 20 or 21 year old male. So I've worked with some really fantastic mediators who are much better than that sort of stuff than I am, and luckily over a fairly long period of time, I've been able to pick up some tricks and hints and some benefit from the experience and the skills of those people to, I think, now become reasonably proficient in that area as well.
Yeah. Oh, look, and it is an area that's particularly challenging, especially those that are trained in the to be an advocate, like a lawyer or whatever. They're often not willing to go into the messy emotions. In fact, that's really one of the things that I particularly wanted to talk to you about. We were having a conversation after a role play that you mentored, and one of the things that you noticed that the student was doing was skirting around those issues that might might cause a bit of controversy, a bit of emotional backlash. And you talked about, why? Why did you do that? And he said, I thought it would be better to let sleeping dogs lie. So in mediation, one of the things we talked about was that, we need to wake up the dogs. We don't let the sleeping dogs lie. Would you maybe be able to expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think you're right there, Joanne. I think that, particularly new mediators have so much to think about and so much to, that they're worried that if they open up certain doors that things are going to get out of their control, or they're not going to be able to pull them back or manage them effectively. And as you say, I think sometimes we see new mediators avoiding the controversial issues or the issues that might have some heat in them, because they're not sure they have the capacity to manage those. A mentor of mine many years ago said to me that as a good mediator, you need to be very comfortable with conflict, and not everyone is. And I've said that to some of the people who I've coached and trained, that you really need to be relaxed and comfortable with people fighting in front of you. That's part of the business, unfortunately. And as I said, some people are not very good with that. They're not very comfortable with that. They're not very relaxed with that. And that's something that some people might need to work on. But as you said, you can't avoid these issues. You can't avoid. I think it's going to be detrimental and it's going to be counterproductive. As you said, if you let the sleeping dogs lie, you're going to do a disservice to the parties rather than really helping them. And I'll give you 3 reasons that I think that's the case. Firstly, part of being a good mediator is recognizing what's important to the parties, not what's important to you, but what's important to the parties.
Yeah.
And often that's about dealing with what's happened in the past. And one of the areas that I've worked in previously, before my time at QCAT, was working with medical negligence matters. And so parties that had suffered harm, either them or their families had suffered harm. And as you can imagine, there's massive amounts of emotion that go with that. If you've had a life-changing injury as a result of surgery, or a child has been injured or even killed sometimes, it's not necessarily, we found, or it's often not about the money. It's not about the dollars at the end of it.
No.
Parties want explanations. They want to understand what's happened. They want ultimately apologies and acknowledgements often more than they want, the dollar figure at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So, often in those circumstances, it's incredibly difficult, but very cathartic at the same time. And wonderful to see people starting to move towards, a healing process. But you can only deal with that, and they can only start that journey if you get sort of into the nuts and bolts of what's happened and how it's happened. So if you just jump straight to the money in those circumstances and say, right, what's it going to take to make this go away?
Yeah.
You're losing a heck of a lot of value. So that's an extreme case, but yeah, it's about what's important to the parties and what do they need from the process. And often that's not just about a solution, but it's about, finding out how did we get here and apologies and whatnot.
Yeah.
The second issue I'd say would...
Sorry, just before you go on. So is that really opening up things during the opening statements of asking people how's that impacted you, or is it more about just pushing a bit deeper in exploration?
Yeah, I think it's about really unpacking exactly what has happened and working through very carefully and gaining an understanding of what the parties, what's important to you, what do you need from this process, and often there's places you need to go that are more than just the superficial, it's about, I guess, delving into those areas that the parties need to explore.
Yeah, no, thank you. So point two. Yeah.
Point two. I think it's often important too for parties to understand how they have arrived where they're at now, so they don't make the same mistakes again in the future. So so often I do neighbourhood type mediations, and we hear parties talking about the truth in mediation, and very, very rarely is there truth in a mediation. It's often about perceptions and about so again, unpacking what has happened in regards to that neighbourhood relationship. Where did this start? How did you respond? What happened next? And parties can get a better understanding of their dynamics, the dynamics between them, the pain points, etc. And they might not still agree on all the issues, but at least they can understand how this has happened and be in a better position not to make the same mistakes again. So it's about, just understanding, and I guess that's very important where there's an ongoing relationship between the parties, where there is going to be a future between them, so that they understand, where have we gone wrong in the past, and hopefully don't make the same mistakes in the future.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me because often people are so close to the issues and they just don't understand why it's happened, and they're not willing to move forward unless they do. So they get really stuck because it's just mystifying to them. But once you, as you say, lay it out, they can get that realisation. Oh, okay, I can see why this has happened.
and oftentimes in a neighbourhood mediation, I'll find myself doing a summary, and basically saying, well, you started here, and then this happened, and this happened. Do you see how that's led to a downward spiral? And the parties are going, oh, okay, now it makes sense.
Yeah.
And hopefully they can do things differently in the future. The last thing is that by exploring the dispute and not letting those sleeping dogs lie, it's classic mediation theory. We give parties the opportunity to negotiate integratively, rather than getting parties stuck in their positions. So they get a chance, if you're doing it well, parties get a chance to put their interest on the table, and then explore solutions that actually might be more mutually acceptable. And no doubt you've heard the old story of the orange, the two people fighting over the orange.
Yeah.
I'm going to get the orange. No, you're going to get the orange. And it turns out that one wants the rind and the other one wants the juice. But until they put their needs on the table, they're going to, just get simply stuck into, either one person gets the orange or the other, or we simply chop the orange in half, and no party really gets what they want entirely. So, unless you do that,
Sorry, I was just going to say that definitely with novice mediators, they really do rush too quickly to trying to reach a compromise agreement,
Yep.
and
And
yeah,
I very frequently again see that in neighbourhood disputes that even things as simple as fences, until parties talk about, one person will say I want fence A, the other person says I want fence B. All of a sudden, once you get parties to talk about, well, what's really important to you? What do you need out of this fence? Is it about security? Is it about aesthetics? Is it about views? Is it about the breezes, etc.? All of a sudden, when people put on the table all those underlying interests and needs, amazingly, a new solution pops up, and it's a
yeah,
better solution than either of them could have thought of. So, um,
absolutely, yeah.
yeah. So unless you do that and you get that stuff on the table, then you're selling the party short.
Yeah, yeah, and that's and so skirting around things that might be a bit controversial is means that they're deliberately not on the table, and
Yep.
it's unlikely to be a sustainable solution, even if they do agree to something, just to get out of the room.
Yeah, and the line of least resistance always isn't always going to give you the best outcome.
Yeah, no, definitely not. Look, just one thing I did want to ask you to expand on a little bit more was about being comfortable with conflict. So, one of the things that concerns me, I do a lot of family mediation where people are triggered by, like clients are triggered if the emotions get too strong and certainly the language. So where's the line that you think needs to be drawn in allowing conflict in the room or in maintaining that business-like environment? What are your thoughts
Yeah,
around that?
that's a kind of complex question, Joe. We might have to
I
have
know. We
another
might.
podcast for that
I
one.
think that would be another really good podcast, and maybe we get a bit of a panel with different opinions on it.
Absolutely. Look, in as short and as sharp a way as I can manage, I don't know that there is a line.
Yeah.
Because I think all parties are different, and what one party is comfortable with is going to be different from what another party is comfortable with, and I think as a mediator, you get to see and understand and pick up on the vibe in the room, and as to what people's tolerance for that conflict level is, and so what's acceptable, what's helpful to one person might be quite different to what's acceptable and helpful to the next person. So that's and I guess that's about reading the parties. It's about reading their body language. It's about trying to get a sense as to when a bit of helpful venting has stepped over the line and become counterproductive abuse. So that's from the party side of things. From the mediator side of things, I think that it's about instinctively how comfortable you are, and I must say I'm much more comfortable now with parties engaging in some fairly overt conflict in front of me than I was when I started as a mediator 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Why is that the case? Partly probably because I'm just more comfortable with it. I've seen it so many times.
Yeah.
But I think it's also about mediators understanding that you can pull it back, and that you're the mediator, you're in control. And so it's partly about normalizing it for the parties and saying, look, it's not necessarily a bad thing that you are expressing these high emotions.
Yeah.
That's part of being in conflict. So it's about normalizing it a little bit. And secondly, it's about saying when I do think it's going too far, I'm in control. I can pull it back. I can acknowledge it. I can acknowledge things for the parties.
Yeah.
And I've got lots of tools up my sleeve. I can break for private session, et cetera, et cetera. So it's about knowing that you are in control of the process and you can pull it back when you need to.
Yeah, I think that's probably the real distinction of So if the mediator's in control, even if the people are expressing themselves strongly, if everyone feels like the mediator's in control, then it's not going to be as fearful. But if the mediator's freaking out, that's not going to be a good place.
It's not a good place to be.
Definitely not. Now, look, I'm just aware of time. There's one thing I did really want to try and get a quick idea from you. You've been mediating since 1992. We're now 2018. What could you say about the changes that have happened in the industry since then? If you could give me a bit of an idea.
Yeah, like when I when I first started in 1992, as I said before, it was just, I guess, the industry or the practice of mediation was particularly in Queensland, only just really beginning, and mediation was taught in an incredibly prescriptive way. So I can remember when I started training that I was given a script that basically went from the start of the mediation to the finish. And I had to use certain words, and I almost had to learn it off like a film script.
Oh, really?
So we've certainly become much more flexible, much less prescriptive. I think that's great. I think, including the Mediation Institute, we're now, I guess, about people being, much more responsive to parties, and much more flexible in terms of how we apply our practice. The other thing which I saw back in the 90s was a lot of square pegs and round holes. So people trying to apply a process that didn't necessarily meet the needs of the parties or the nature of the dispute. And again, I think we've become a lot more savvy in the last sort of 20 years in terms of modifying our processes according to the needs of the parties. Obviously, we all need to start from the same place, which is the facilitative model. But when you get to the real world, that very basic facilitative process doesn't necessarily meet all circumstances. And so, I think one of the lessons for mediators particularly is, as a mediator, you're constantly learning. And so, as a newly accredited mediator, having understood facilitative mediation, that's great. But that's only the start of the journey. You will continue to learn your craft. You will continue to see that there are various models that you can move into. And I think, the really good mediators are the ones that can, as I said, don't put the square peg in the round hole, that they can modify their practice and provide a service that's really responsive to the party's needs.
Yeah. Look, and that's a great note to end on, because ultimately the national accreditation as a mediator, facility of mediation process, it's a short course. It really is just the starting point, very much the basic first step.
Yeah, and I would say, Joanne, and what you do at the Institute is fantastic, and we really get people off to a flying start. But as I said, I've been mediating for 25 years now, and I'm still learning. I'm still picking up stuff from people and colleagues and people that I work with. So it's a long journey and one of constant learning.
That learning, so definitely attending events and conferences, and I know that you're speaking at the National Mediation Conference next year, as I am, and there'll be some wonderful presentations we'll get to see. I'm just wondering about co-mediation as a learning method. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, look, I'm a big advocate for co-mediation, and is probably one of the things that really fast-tracked my learning in the early days.
Yeah.
I was very fortunate at the Community Justice Program that they only used co-mediation for quite a long time at that service. And so, as I said, I got to work with people who had a whole range of skills and experience that I didn't have. And I guess on occasions, I may have learned from them, and they may have learned from me. But I think it's just an invaluable way of working alongside people who have complementary skills. The other thing I would say is that if you're going to do that, another skill for you as a mediator is to be able to take feedback. So if you work in that environment and you do have the opportunity to work as a co-mediator, I think it's a great opportunity for learning, but you need to be able to give feedback appropriately, and also need to be able to effectively take feedback. It's it's a gift that's been given to you by someone else. You can do with it what you wish. But as I said, it's I think a great way of learning.
No, that's great. Well, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else that you think really needs to be said before we finish off?
No, I think we've covered a fair bit of territory. There might be some, another one or two podcasts, as you said, that might have arisen as a result of our
Definitely.
The only final thing I'd probably say, Joanne, is for those people that are listening to the podcast is one of the great things about mediation is I think because you are not an advisor and there's not that pressure to tell people what to do and how to do it. There's an issue about longevity. I've been doing this for 25 years. I'm still really enjoying the work. I don't see myself doing anything else. And as I said, I think it's one of the great things about mediation is that you are helping people to help themselves.
That's a perfect place to end. We help people to help themselves, and we come in as a catalyst. So thank you once more, Peter, and we'll definitely be looking forward to having some more conversations with you later in the year about some of these other topics that we just touched on, but would love to explore a bit more deeply. And thank you to you for listening all the way through to the end of the podcast. Please subscribe. We'll be uploading new episodes every week of the Mediation Musings and some other ideas. So I'm Joanne Law. Take care, and please share your comments.